Hello, beautiful people, from day 6 of this incredible motorcycle ride through the Himalayas in Nepal. Today we'll make it to an extremely remote walled city that has only been open to visitors for the last 30 years. Filtering my water for the day became my regular morning routine. I'm so grateful that I took my Katadyn Be-Free water filter. It was one of my most used pieces of gear I took on this entire trip. We all had breakfast in this big room at the KC Heaven Hotel in Dakmar with this wonderful view of the Red Cliffs. And thanks to some magic glue from our mechanic, my helmet mount was back in one piece again, and I felt really optimistic about the day. It's the little things. This was the day that it really struck me how remote we were now in Upper Mustang. This area of Nepal is unlike anything I had expected. The scale of the landscape we were riding through was something you could only barely grasp in person. The camera cannot truly give context to the grandeur of the wilderness here. We climbed onto this incredible plateau. The air was so dry you could feel the lack of moisture in your nose. The humid air from the plains and the lowlands cannot penetrate the plateau, which results in this vast, barren desert landscape that sits in the rain shadow of Dhaulagiri, the 7th highest mountain in the world, and the rest of the Annapurna Range. The few sources of water here are small springs and glacial runoff streams. Despite the lack of humidity in the air, it is thick with the weight of reverence for a landscape that seems to be tied intrinsically to the spiritualism of this place. Wow. I'm glad we're on motorcycles. Our first stop of the day was Gargampa. Gargampa Monastery was built in the 8th century by the famous Tibetan guru Padmasambhava, aka Guru Rinpoche.
And once we're inside to the sanctuary, no pictures.
No pictures. Inside are ancient scriptures, murals, and paintings that depict the life of the Buddha and Guru Rinpoche. We received a blessing from a monk who tied gold fabric around our necks for our journey. I wanted so badly to stay there for so much longer than our short stop for tea and absorb more of the feeling of awe these places generated in me. One of the stories of this place that Tashi told me says that after Guru Rinpoche colored the cliffs of Dokmar red with the blood of a demon, he then took the heart of the demon and cremated it at this place where this monastery now stands. He buried the remains of the demon's heart and then built the monastery over it. As we left Gargampa, the road felt like we were no longer on a well-used tourist path. It felt like we were on a farmer's access road. In some places, it was riddled with large rocks, and in others, the road was washed away from water runoff, and in some places, it dissolved into a fine silt that made you wobble if you came in too hot. We rode through some tiny villages where incredible people carved a living out of this place that felt so desolate to me and my reference points in Montana and Oregon. I was fascinated with the rough, rammed earth architecture that gave this sense that the homes are fused to the mountains around them. They are built in the Tibetan style, which shows the survival of Tibetan culture here in Nepal. Quote, "In Mustang district, many rural houses are constructed by using mud. A traditional house is made from stone and brick walls, roofs made with poplar wooden beams, and willow twigs covered with straw, grass, mud, and clay, sometimes even with the dung of cows, donkeys, or horses to increase its solidness." This area is one of the few places in the Himalayan region that has maintained its traditional culture and environment due to its challenging terrain. The roads that link these remote villages to Kathmandu are still fairly new in the grand scheme of things. 75% of the people who live here spend the harsh winter months in Kathmandu and Pokhara. Many locals had already begun the move down to the lowlands when we came through in October. In a search to understand more of the indigenous people's way of life, I stumbled upon a short book called A Dying Indigenous Village of Lo, which outlined what life in one of these small villages had been like for the older generation before they started to experience a combination of drought as their water sources dried up, and then too much water as hot days and unusual rainfall caused catastrophic floods. The flooding is evident in the scarred landscape here and explains the areas of dried fields that were once green farmland and pastures. There is now a divide in generations as the young people are sent to the lowlands for their future and the older generation stays in Upper Mustang and share concerns about what will happen to their culture. Not only as more tourism reaches these far-off places, but also as a younger generation lean towards less traditional ways of life. Reading more about this was simultaneously enlightening and bleak. You can't learn about a place so charged with mysticism without the balance between dark and light, I suppose. So, in my search for understanding more clearly a fascinating culture, I also found heart-wrenching stories of uprooted villages and their struggles to maintain their way of life in the face of modern times and all the challenges that come with them. As we approached the walled city, the road became loose with a top layer of silt, which made it a little tricky to navigate. Foreign visitors have only been allowed in this region starting in 1992, but tourism in Upper Mustang is heavily regulated with permits, and you have to have a licensed guide. Previously, there were only 2 other Westerners permitted to visit the walled city, in 1952 and 1964. Comparatively, now thousands of tourists visit the city during the high season between July, August, and October. We stayed at Hotel Mandala, which was actually run by Tashi's family, which already looked impressive. And then when you realize everything they needed to build it had to come up the way that we did, it's remarkable. We all had a little bit of lunch and went on a short walk together around the walled city so we could see the monastery. The city's whitewashed mud brick walls were built to protect the royal palace. The 5-story palace was built by the first king of Lamantang, Magpie, in 1440. The palace was unfortunately partially destroyed by the earthquake that devastated Nepal in 2015. And there are parts that have been renovated since then, but it is no longer the home of the cultural king of Mustang. And when the modern cultural king visits, he stays in part of the palace that wasn't destroyed by the earthquake. We wandered through the tight, labyrinth-like streets of the city and came upon this woman weaving. I asked permission to record her and stay and watch, and she said yes. The rest of the group moved on while I watched her work. It felt very, very special to be there for me. Oh, amazing! So cool! Afterwards, she gave me a cookie, and I wandered through the streets alone. It was so incredibly silent, you naturally felt like you should whisper because you were in a holy place. And then a cow came around a corner.
Hi, sweetie.
I couldn't believe how small they were. Full-grown cows are barely the size of our yearlings on the ranch in Montana. They were maybe 3.5 feet tall at the shoulder, which is roughly a meter for my metric friends.
Aren't you a pretty baby?
I wandered around trying to absorb as much as humanly possible until the light left me. The next morning, day 7, we had a 0 day. The group chose to ride towards the border, but when I expressed interest in hanging around town, Tashi helped me arrange a tour guide that would take me to a local hot spring on horseback. You might not know this, but horses were my first love well before motorcycles. I paid for 2 horses so the guide could ride 2, but there was a little twist. When I met my lovely guide, he spoke no English at all. We smiled and gestured introductions, and he helped me mount my horse, which was the size of a pony, and began to lead me out of town. The stirrups were so short, I was squatting in the saddle. I tried to stop him a couple of times to gesture that the other horse was for him to ride, and he would smile and wave his hand and continue on until we came to the hot spring. We took a break here, and we tried to communicate in hand gestures and drawings in the dirt where each of us were from and how big our families were. All the while, I was just awestruck by the incredible scenery around us. He gestured to me that we could go see some caves, so I nodded and we mounted back up, and I tried again to speak that he should ride too, and finally he nodded and mounted up, and we took off down the road together. The pony seemed very pleased to have more of their head, and it felt so elating to get to be here riding horses in the Himalayas. We came to a suspension bridge and tied the horses at the foot and climbed up to the caves. From what I gathered from our gestured conversation, they were used to store yak feed maybe? Or maybe yak meat. We picked up small carvings that had fallen on the ground and put them back on their little altars together, and I chose not to film inside the caves because I was just enjoying having such a lovely, wholesome interaction with my guide. We rode together all the way back to town, and I felt so happy. Not a single word exchanged, just shared smiles and the bells on the horses and hooves on stone. Somehow, in that silence, we understood each other more clearly than any spoken language could ever convey. We returned to the city, and I dismounted, and we waved goodbye to each other. And wandering about the city in the golden light of the afternoon, I realized then that this had been the best day of the entire trip. I explored a bit more until I spotted our group coming back into town. I watched them fill tanks the local way before I headed back to my room to gather my things and make sure that I was ready to get back on the road the next day. I used a bar of soap to clean and lube the zippers on my jacket that had become jammed with fine silt, and I found myself reflecting that there was no way I was going to beat the high of this day for the rest of the trip. Question for my end screen crew: would you have ridden from Kathmandu through all of those crazy roads just to experience the walled city of Limantong? Let me know.